My name is Martha Evelyn Rose. I'm 81 years old now, and I live in a small house on the outskirts of Savannah, where seagulls cry in the mornings and the wind rustles the curtains in the evenings, as if the house breathes with me. Sometimes I sit in a rocking chair on the porch, holding a cup of sweet tea, and think about the many roads my life has traveled. Some were sunlit, others shrouded in such darkness that I still wonder how I ever escaped. I rarely tell my story. For years, it lived inside me, like a locked room, the door to which I was afraid to open even to myself. But time is a strange thing. It doesn't erase memory, but it teaches you to face it. And now, when I have nothing left to lose, I feel obligated to speak. Not for justification or pity. For those who may be living in fear right now, thinking there's no way out. I was born in Haven Creek, a small town in Mississippi where houses were scattered and people were bound not only by family, but also by a culture of silence. It was customary not to ask unnecessary questions. Respect for reputation mattered more than the truth. My father, Henry Rose, was one of the most respected men in the county. He owned a sawmill, employed half the men in the county, donated money to the church, and always sat in the front row on Sundays. His voice was loud, his laugh infectious, his handshake firm. People spoke of him with admiration and called him a role model. To the outside world, he was a pillar of the community. To us, he was something else entirely. Our house stood behind the sawmill warehouse, right by the river. It was old, wooden, with floors that creaked with every step. It constantly smelled of tree resin and damp earth. There were 5 of us living there. My father, my mother, Lydia, me, and my 2 younger sisters, Nora and Emmy. Nora was 2 years younger than me, quiet and observant, as if always expecting trouble. Emmy was born when I was almost 10. She was a sunny child, laughing loudly, asking endless questions, and believing the world was inherently good. My mother was once like that, too. At least, that's what I was told. I remember her as a beautiful woman with soft hands and a warm voice, but those memories end very early. Over time, she began to lie in the dark bedroom more and more often, taking medications that made her gaze blank and her movements slow. In our house, we called it nerves. No one mentioned the word depression, and there was no help for such women back then. My mother gradually faded away, remaining close by. When I was 11, I was already running the household. I cooked, washed, looked after my sisters, and helped in the sawmill office. My father said I would be good if I learned to be useful. His praise was rare, and therefore especially valuable. I tried to earn it, not realizing that no amount of effort could protect me from what was coming. The sawmill was the center of our lives. I often went there after school, helping sort papers, counting money, learning how to keep records. It was there that I first sensed something was wrong. At first, it was the looks, too long, too attentive. Then the seemingly casual words about how I was growing, how I was changing. I felt like I simply didn't understand adults, that I was just imagining things. I was a child and wanted to believe the world worked just right. I was 12 years old on that day that changed my life forever. The sawmill had already closed, the workers had left, and the sun was setting. My father said he needed help with the reports. I stayed. The office was quiet. The only sound was the dripping of water somewhere behind the wall. He asked me to sit next to him, then closer. I remember the smell, a mixture of sweat, tobacco, and wood. I remember how my body refused to obey, how my mind seemed to detach from me, leaving only a cold emptiness. I didn't understand what was happening. I only knew that this was wrong, that I was ashamed and scared, and that I wanted to disappear. He told me it was a secret, that if I told, my mother wouldn't be able to bear it and would die. At 12, such words sounded like a death sentence. I believed him. From that day on, fear became part of my daily life. I learned to read my father's mood by his steps, his tone of voice, the way he opened the door. I tried to be inconspicuous, tried to always keep my sisters close. When I realized that Nora had also begun to change, that the same empty, dull look that I had had appeared in her eyes, something inside me finally broke. I tried to talk. With my mother, in her rare moments of clarity. With the teacher, cautiously, innuendo-wise. With the pastor during confession. Each time I hit a wall. They told me I should respect my father, that fantasies were dangerous, that family matters shouldn't be brought to light. And every such conversation convinced me of one thing. I was alone. But there was also Emmy, my little sister with curly hair and a laughter that filled the house. She trusted my father unconditionally. She ran to him when he returned from work. And every time I saw this, my heart sank with horror. I knew that one day he would look at her the same way he once looked at me. It was then, without yet fully realizing it, that I ceased to be just a child. Something new began to grow within me, a cold, firm determination. I didn't know exactly how, but I knew for sure I wouldn't let it happen again, even if it meant doing something that would change my fate forever. That was just the beginning. Back then, I had no idea how much pain, fear, and decisions lay ahead. I only knew one thing. The world can be cruel, but sometimes survival requires courage that few adults are capable of. And in that moment, at 12 years old, my childhood ended forever. After that day, I began to live as if a constant anxiety had settled inside me. It didn't scream, didn't try to get out. It was simply there. It woke up with me, went to school, sat next to me at the dinner table, went to bed when I closed my eyes. I no longer felt like a child, even though outwardly nothing had changed. I still wore simple dresses, braided my hair, and did my homework at the kitchen table. But inside, I felt like I'd aged years all at once. I quickly realized I could only rely on myself. My mother continued to disappear into her illness. Sometimes she might be there in body, but not in mind. On those days, she looked at us as if we were distant acquaintances, not her daughters. In rare moments of light, she would hug me, stroke my hair, ask how school was going. I always hoped that today would be the day she truly heard me. But as soon as I took a step toward the truth, fear would appear in her eyes, and the conversation would end. School wasn't a salvation. I was a good student, but I stopped raising my hand. I felt that if I became too noticeable, the world would again turn its gaze on me, the one that made me want to disappear. The teachers considered me calm and mature beyond my years. No one asked why I stopped laughing, why I no longer played with the other girls during recess. Nora stayed by my side almost constantly. She didn't say anything, but I saw her flinch when my father entered the room, her shoulders tense, as if bracing herself for a blow. Sometimes at night, she would cry quietly, hiding under the covers. I would hold her and whisper that everything would be okay. not knowing if it was true. These words weren't a promise, but a prayer. Emmy remained in her own world for now. She still believed that adults were always right, that home was a safe place, that her father was a hero. I looked at her and felt both love and terror. Love because she was pure and alive. Terror because I knew how easily that light could be destroyed. I began to organize our lives around one goal, never leaving Emmy alone with my father. I came up with reasons why she should be with me or Nora. I took her with me even when it was inconvenient. Sometimes my father would get angry, saying I was too bossy, that the girl needed to get used to being independent. At such moments, I lowered my eyes and apologized, pretending to obey. But inside, I counted his every step, every pause, every glance. Over time, I realized that fear could be exploited. My father wasn't afraid of being exposed, but of losing control. He didn't want anyone to see us too closely for too long. This gave me small but important opportunities. I learned to be unnoticed, yet attentive. I learned to listen without asking questions. I learned to remember. That's when I really began helping out at the sawmill. At first, it was just shuffling papers, then counting, then real bookkeeping. My father was proud of me. He told the neighbors that he had a smart daughter. His pride was a weapon for me. The more he trusted me, the more I knew. I saw men coming in who weren't on the employee list. How conversations behind closed doors became sharp and short. How my father got nervous on certain days of the month. I didn't understand all the details, but I remembered them. Everything I saw and heard came together inside me, like the parts of a large, still unclear mechanism. There were moments when I thought about running away. I imagined Nora, Emmy, and I simply leaving. Anywhere. To another city, to people who didn't know us. But every time I tried to imagine it seriously, the fear returned with renewed vigor. I had no money, no adults to protect us, no certainty that we wouldn't be brought back. One day, I finally decided to talk to my mother again. It was an evening when she seemed more alive than usual. She was sitting by the window, looking out at the river. I approached her and told her I was afraid for Emmy. I didn't name names, I didn't say anything direct. I simply said the house wasn't safe. She was silent for a long time, then quietly said that I had to be strong, that sometimes women have to endure for the sake of their children. These words hurt more than any scream. I realized there would be no help. From that moment on, the last hope for adults disappeared inside me. All that remained was responsibility. I was the eldest. I had to protect the younger ones, at any cost. The turning point came one hot evening when I saw my father standing at the door of our room, looking at Emmy. There was nothing justifiable in that look. I recognized it instantly. The same coldness, the same greed, the same confidence in his impunity. In that moment, I stopped doubting. The future was no longer foggy. It was sharp and clear. I stepped forward, not thinking about the consequences. I told him to leave her alone. In response, I heard laughter and threats, spoken as calmly as if he were talking about the weather. He said no one would believe me, that if I tried anything, everyone would suffer. These words didn't frighten me. They merely confirmed what I already knew. That night I didn't sleep. I lay between Nora and Emmy, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak in the wind. There was no hysteria in my head, no tears. There was only a cold, heavy understanding. Sometimes the world leaves no choice. Sometimes it forces a child to make a decision no child should have to make. I didn't yet know exactly how I would do it. I only knew that I couldn't wait any longer. That if I remained silent again, the price would be too high. I understood that any step could ruin our lives. But I also understood that inaction would surely destroy her. That night, I became different. Not a victim, not a frightened girl, but a person no longer willing to close my eyes. And although I didn't yet understand the full depth of the path I'd embarked on, one thing was clear. There was no turning back. It was the beginning of the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another, a path that would lead me to decisions whose consequences I would bear for the rest of my life. After that night, when I saw my father's gaze on Emmy, time seemed to change its course. The days began to drag on slowly, heavily, as if every minute was deliberately testing my resilience. I no longer lived by waiting, I lived by observing. I watched, listened, memorized. Everything around me became a system of signs, and I learned to read it as carefully as I once learned to read the letters in a school ABC book. My father acted as if nothing had happened. He laughed at dinner, told loud stories, boasted about the progress at the sawmill. To the outside world, he remained the same Henry Rose, reliable, confident, respected. But to me, every move he made was false. I saw how his attention increasingly lingered on Emmy, how he looked for the moment when I or Nora were busy, how irritated he became when plans fell through. I realized I could no longer rely on intuition alone. I needed facts, leverage, something tangible that could stop him. And then I delved even deeper into the sawmill. My father had given me this access himself, thinking he was teaching me useful skills. He didn't realize he was giving me the keys to his own cage. Papers told more than people. Numbers didn't lie if you knew how to read them. I saw discrepancies, omissions, strange entries. I saw how the sums didn't add up, how the same transactions were reflected differently in different notebooks. At first, I thought I was simply misunderstanding something. Then I realized my father was playing a double game. Over time, I learned to distinguish which books were for the auditors and which were for himself. I learned where he kept the real records. I memorized names, dates, amounts. I didn't know why exactly I needed all this, but I felt it was important. This could be a way out. A man named Roy Hartman often showed up at the sawmill. He arrived once a month, always at the same time. He was sturdy, silent, with cold eyes. My father changed when Roy entered the office. He became tense, abrupt. After their meetings, he drank more than usual and was especially angry. I overheard snatches of conversations, noticed how money disappeared after Hartman's visits, how my father nervously counted the bills. I didn't know all the details then, but I understood one thing. Father owed me something. And it wasn't the kind of debt you talk about out loud. Meanwhile, I continued to live a double life. By day, I was an obedient daughter, a responsible helpmate. By night, I was the doorkeeper, the sister's protector, a girl learning not to cry. Nora became even quieter. She rarely looked her father in the eye. Sometimes I noticed bruises on her, which she tried to hide with long sleeves. We didn't talk about it. We didn't need words. Emmy remained untouched for now, but her naivety became even more dangerous. She still trusted her father, seeking his approval. I saw how he exploited this, how he slowly, carefully prepared the ground. It was worse than any scream or blow to see how evil crept in, disguised as care. One evening, while Mom was lying in her room again, drugged, and Nora was helping me in the kitchen, Dad said he wanted to talk to Emmy alone. I felt a knot in my stomach. I found an excuse to stay by my side, saying Emmy needed help with her homework. He looked at me as if I was holding him back, but he backed off. For now. After that, I realized there was no time left. He wouldn't stop. He was just waiting for the right moment. I started thinking not like a child, but like an adult backed into a corner. I ran through every option in my head. Escape seemed impossible. Appealing to the authorities seemed pointless. Every adult I'd tried to approach before either didn't believe me or chose not to interfere. My father's reputation was stronger than any words. There was only one way left: to destroy that reputation, to strip him of the power that made him untouchable. I didn't yet know how far I'd go, but I already knew it would be dangerous. I began to act cautiously. I made copies of notes, copied numbers into a separate notebook, which I hid under the floorboards in our room. I learned to forge handwriting by watching my father write. I eavesdropped on the workers' conversations, trying to figure out who knew what. I even began to notice that some adults suspected something but were afraid to speak up. In this strange new world, I found an unexpected ally, Mrs. Crawford, an elderly woman who cooked for the workers. She had seen a lot. She had seen my bruises, seen Nora's gaze, seen how I shielded Emmy from view. We never spoke directly, but one day she said something that I've always remembered. Sometimes evil doesn't go away on its own. It needs to be pushed out. These words were confirmation for me. I no longer doubted that I had the right to defend myself and my sisters, even if the world said I was wrong. The most terrifying conversation happened a few weeks later. My father tried to separate me from Emmy again. When I stood between them, he grabbed my hand so tightly that I couldn't bend it for a long time. He whispered to me that I was taking on too much, that he could separate us, that no one would side with an ungrateful daughter. At that moment, I saw the real him, not the respected businessman, not the father of a family, but the man who reveled in his power. And the fear went away. Only clarity remained. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I stared into the darkness and thought about how strange the world works, how easily it allows some people to ruin the lives of others simply because they are stronger, older, or more respected. I thought that if I didn't do anything, Emmy would one day lie there just like Nora, with empty eyes and someone else's shame inside. And then the decision finally formed within me. I would use everything I knew, everything I'd seen, everything I'd learned. I would turn his strength into his weakness. I would confront him with those he truly feared. I didn't yet know all the steps, but I knew where to start, and I knew there was no turning back. That night, I stopped being just a daughter. I became someone willing to go to the end to protect those I love, even if the price was higher than I could ever imagine. A decision made one night doesn't disappear with the dawn. It doesn't dissolve in the morning light or weaken with the first sounds of day. It remains. It walks beside you, breathes with you, looks through your eyes. In my case, it became the only thing that kept me from despair. I no longer asked myself if I was doing the right thing. I only asked if I would have time. From that moment on, I began to act systematically, without rushing, without revealing myself. I understood that the slightest mistake could cost us dearly. My father was an observant man. He noticed changes, even if he didn't always understand their causes. So I continued to play the role of the obedient daughter. I smiled, nodded, agreed. I pretended his words had power over me. Inside, however, I was building a completely different world, cold, calculating. I delved even deeper into the sawmill papers. I knew which days my father was especially nervous, when he expected Roy Hartman to visit. I knew which books he showed and which he hid. I knew where he kept the real numbers, in an old metal drawer under his desk, tucked so tightly that it could only be opened with a small, sticky latch. He thought only he knew the secret. He was wrong. I began copying the data, carefully, slowly. I did it so the changes wouldn't be immediately obvious, but upon closer inspection, they would look like deliberate fabrications. I added extra zeros, moved amounts around, creating traces that indicated not just carelessness, but deception. I knew that if someone like Hart saw this, they wouldn't spend long trying to figure it out. Nora became my shadow. She didn't ask questions, but she understood more than I would have liked. Sometimes our eyes would meet, and there was a silent agreement in those glances. She would keep an eye on Emmy when I stayed late at the sawmill. She would warn me if father was in a bad mood. We learned to communicate wordlessly, like soldiers in foreign territory. Meanwhile, Emmy was growing. She began asking questions that hadn't occurred to her before. Why was Mom always sleeping? Why did Dad get angry when I didn't answer right away? Why were you always there? I smiled and said that was how it was, that I simply loved her. And it was true. Love was the only thing in my life that wasn't a pretense. One day, Father noticed that I was spending too much time working on paperwork. He told me I shouldn't bother my head with adult matters. There was suspicion in his voice. I felt a tightening inside, but I remained calm on the outside. I said I just wanted to be helpful. He looked at me carefully, then turned away. I realized he was starting to feel something, but he didn't yet know what it was. That same evening, he tried to be alone with Emmy again. This time, I didn't make excuses. I simply stood between them. It was a quiet moment, without shouting. He looked at me with a hatred he no longer tried to hide. There was a promise in that look. I knew he wouldn't back down after that. He would either break me, or I would destroy his world. That night, I made another decision. I realized I needed a witness. Not a person, but circumstances. I needed the truth to come out, not in my name. I needed it to look like Father had brought this on himself. I couldn't allow anyone to connect this to us. I began to prepare the ground for Hart's visit. I knew he would come in a few days. I knew Father would be alone in his office. I knew he'd try to explain, to weasel out of it, perhaps shift the blame. I made sure he had no chance. The day before the visit, I left some of the real documents where they could be easily found. I loosened the lock on the drawer. I placed the notes that pointed to systematic deception on top of the folders. I did it carefully, as if my father himself had been careless out of fatigue or overconfidence. I felt no joy. There was no sense of triumph. There was only tension, so intense that sometimes I felt like I couldn't breathe. I understood that I was playing with forces beyond my control, but there was no choice. On the day of the visit, I took Nora and Emmy out of the house early. I said we were going to the river to collect pebbles. Father didn't object. He was too focused on the upcoming meeting. I saw his hands tremble as he closed the door behind us. It was the first time I saw fear in him. Real fear. We spent a few hours at the neighbor's. I tried to remain calm, but I listened to the sounds of the road every minute. As the sun began to set, I felt something had happened. It wasn't a premonition, but a knowing. As cold and clear as the decision I'd made earlier. That night, Father didn't return. The house was eerily quiet. I sat by the window and looked out onto the road while Nora and Emmy slept. Inside me, there was neither panic nor relief, only emptiness and anticipation. In the morning, people in town began talking, in whispers, cautiously. They said something bad had happened at the sawmill, that Henry Rose had gotten involved with the wrong people, that debt was a dangerous thing. No one looked at us with suspicion. They pitied us. It was a strange, bitter feeling to be the object of sympathy for something that had finally stopped hurting. When the body was found, I didn't go look. I didn't need to see. I knew it was over. I knew we had survived. The price of that knowledge was heavy, but inevitable. That day, for the first time, I allowed myself to think about the future. Not the next step, not the next threat, but what would come next. I didn't know what it would be like. I only knew what it would no longer be like. It wouldn't contain the fear I fell asleep with every night. It wouldn't contain the look that made me want to disappear. But new trials awaited us. The world doesn't become a kind place just because one monster disappears. We had to learn to live without constant threat, learning to be a family not out of fear, but out of choice. And this, as I didn't yet understand, was no less difficult than the struggle for survival. After my father's death, a strange silence fell over the house. It wasn't the silence we were accustomed to, not tense, not filled with the anticipation of disaster. It was empty, almost awkward, like a room from which heavy furniture had been removed, and now you don't know where to put your feet. Nora, Emmy, and I walked around the house carefully, as if afraid to upset the fragile balance of our new state. The first few days passed in a blur. Neighbors came by, brought food, and offered words of sympathy. They looked at us with pity and a kind of belated remorse, as if only now allowing themselves to admit that something had always been wrong in our home. I accepted their condolences with polite detachment. I didn't want gratitude or conversation. I was preoccupied with one thing, keeping us together. My mother barely reacted to what was happening. When she was told of her husband's death, she merely nodded and closed her eyes again. It seemed she'd long since lived in a world where he didn't exist. A few days later, her condition worsened. The doctors spoke quietly, avoiding direct words, but I knew she couldn't cope. Her illness was too deep, too advanced. She passed away a month later, as quietly as she had lived her last years. There were only 3 of us left. I was 13, Nora was 11, Emmy was only 8. Technically, we were orphans, though I'd long since felt like an adult. But it's one thing to feel responsible and quite another to bear it in a world where papers, signatures, and other people's decisions decide everything. Authorities arrived in town. They asked questions, took notes, checked documents. My father's death was quickly ruled the result of business disagreements. No one was overzealous in looking for the guilty. Henry Rose's name disappeared from conversations as quickly as it appeared in the obituary. It was convenient for everyone. The question of our future arose. By law, we were supposed to be handed over to relatives or placed under guardianship. Our only living relative was my maternal aunt, a woman we'd only seen a couple of times. She lived far away and wasn't eager to take on the responsibility of 3 girls. This was my chance. I spoke to the adults confidently, almost brazenly. I told them how long I'd been running the household, how I helped with the chores, how I kept an eye on my sisters. I didn't talk about the fear, the sleepless nights, or how I sometimes wanted to hide. I spoke in a language they understood, the language of responsibility and order. Money played a decisive role. It turned out my father had an insurance policy. No one expected it, but he did. The amount wasn't huge, but it was enough to provide us with temporary stability. Furthermore, part of the sawmill property was sold to cover debts. The remainder went to us. This made me not just a child in the eyes of adults, but someone who could cope. After lengthy discussions and checks, I was allowed to temporarily remain as my sister's guardian under the supervision of social services. It was both humiliating and terrifying. Every week, people came to see us, observing how we lived, asking questions, checking if the house was clean and if there was food. I smiled, answered, nodded. I knew the slightest mistake and we would be separated. We sold the house by the river. I couldn't stand being there anymore. Too many memories, too many shadows. With the money, we moved to another town, small but vibrant, where no one knew us. I went to work there after school. First, I washed dishes, then helped out in the store, and later in a small office where my skills with numbers were needed. Nora gradually began to come to life. She was still quiet, but a spark appeared in her eyes. She started drawing again, like she had as a child, spending hours with pencils, creating worlds that were brighter than our past. Emmy was growing up fast. She asked questions, sometimes awkward, sometimes too adult. Answered honestly but carefully. I wanted her to know the truth, but not bear its weight prematurely. It was hard for me to allow myself to be weak. I didn't cry. I didn't complain. I felt like if I stopped for even a minute, everything would collapse. I lived on autopilot, fulfilling my responsibilities, meeting my needs, moving forward. Only at night, when the house was asleep, would I sometimes allow myself to sit in the dark and feel tired. Not fear, tiredness. Over time, we began to build a new life. I finished school, despite working. The teachers were amazed at my persistence. I didn't tell them that for me, it wasn't a pursuit of knowledge, but a way to maintain control over the future. Education was something no one could take away from me. The past didn't disappear. It returned in dreams, in random smells, in the loud voices of men on the street. But it no longer controlled me. I learned to live with it, like a scar, painful, but healed. Sometimes I thought about what I'd done, about the line between necessity and sin. These thoughts didn't provide clear answers. But every time I saw Emmy laugh without fear, Nora fall asleep peacefully, I knew I would do the same again. We survived. That was the main thing. New roads, new decisions, new trials awaited us. But the worst was behind us. We were no longer prisoners of someone else's power. We had become a family by choice, bound not by fear, but by care and responsibility. And it was then, in this strange, difficult freedom, that I first began to think not only about survival, but also about meaning. About how to turn what I'd experienced not into a burden, but into strength. About how to prevent the pain from being passed on. These thoughts would become the seeds of the future. But then I didn't yet know what they would grow into. I only knew one thing. Our story wasn't over. It was only beginning. Freedom turned out to be more than just a gift as I initially thought. I'd long dreamed of a life without fear, without constant tension, without having to listen for every step outside the door. But when that fear disappeared, it left a void that needed to be filled. The world suddenly felt too big, too open, and I didn't immediately understand how to exist in it. We settled into the new city slowly, carefully, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace. I rented a small house on the outskirts, old but clean. It had only 2 bedrooms, and Nora and I shared one, leaving the other for Emmy. I deliberately made sure she had her own space, her own territory, where she could feel safe. This seemed important to me, almost symbolic. Work became my salvation. I clung to it like an anchor. School in the morning, part-time jobs in the afternoon, and housework in the evening. I was exhausted to the point of exhaustion, but this fatigue was honest. It didn't eat away at me from the inside, like the old fear. It allowed me to fall asleep without thoughts, without memories. Nora started attending art classes. The teacher noticed her talent and treated her with particular warmth. I saw her change, how her shoulders gradually straightened, how she began to believe she could be more than the frightened girl from the past. Sometimes she brought home drawings. They were full of light, open spaces, sky, water. Almost never of people. I didn't ask why. Emmy grew up faster than everyone else. She was curious, stubborn, and had a strong character. Sometimes she got angry with me, saying I was too strict, that I wasn't a mother. And she was right. I wasn't a mother. I was something else, a mix of sister, caretaker, protector, and boss. I had to set rules, monitor, and forbid. I knew that one day she would understand why I was like that. Social services continued to visit us. Every visit was a test. I prepared for them in advance, checking everything 10 times. I felt like they were looking for an excuse to take my sisters away from me. Perhaps that was an exaggeration, but the fear of losing them was too strong. I smiled, answered questions, demonstrated order and stability. I learned to speak without saying too much. Gradually, the visits became less frequent. This was the first sign that they were beginning to trust us. I allowed myself to relax a little but not completely. Complete relaxation seemed dangerous. In high school, I met a man who changed my perception of adults. His name was Mr. Collins, and he taught math. He was strict but fair. He noticed when students were trying, and he respected it. One day, he kept me after class and asked why I was working so hard. I answered honestly, because I had to. He didn't press the issue further. He simply said that if I ever needed help with admissions or school, I could contact him. It was unexpected. Simple, unconditional support, no pressure. For the first time, I felt that an adult could be reliable without demanding anything in return. This discovery was both frightening and reassuring. I began to think about the future, not just about tomorrow, but about who I wanted to be. These thoughts came cautiously, like guests who aren't sure if they're welcome. I knew I wanted to work with people, with children. I'd seen too much pain to simply pass by. But back then it was just a vague feeling, not a plan. The past would suddenly resurface. Sometimes I'd see a man on the street who looked like my father, and my heart would beat faster. Sometimes the sharp smell of wood or tobacco would unsettle me. At such moments, I'd stop, take a deep breath, and remind myself, this isn't happening anymore. It's still there. Nora decided to talk to me one day. It happened late at night, when Emmy was already asleep. She was silent for a long time, then said she still had nightmares, that sometimes she felt guilty for surviving. I listened to her and realized I felt the same way. I just never allowed myself to admit it out loud. We sat next to each other in silence, holding hands. It was one of the most honest moments of my life. I began to understand that survival isn't the end of the road. It's only the beginning. The real work begins later, when you have to learn to live, not just exist. Learn to trust, build, dream. It turned out to be more difficult than fighting. When I finished school, the question of further education became pressing. I was afraid to leave my sisters even for a day, let alone move. But I also understood that without an education, our opportunities would be limited. We discussed it at length. Nora supported me. Emmy protested at first, but then resigned herself to it when she realized I wouldn't disappear from her life. I enrolled in college in the same city. It was a compromise between my dream and responsibility. Studying was difficult, but I was ready for it. Every exam, every completed assignment was a step toward a future in which we would no longer depend on chance. At college, I encountered the world of people again. Different personalities, views, stories. I learned to interact without closing myself off completely. I learned to be not only strong but also vulnerable, though that was the hardest part. The past didn't disappear. It had become a part of me, but it no longer defined my every step. I began to understand that I could use my experience not as an anchor, but as a compass. It showed me where I didn't want to return and what I wanted to change in this world. It was then that the idea first arose in me that one day I could help other children just like my sisters and I. That I could create a space where fear wouldn't be the norm, where adults would be a protection, not a threat. This thought was terrifying in its immensity, but it also gave meaning to everything I had experienced. I didn't yet know how exactly this would happen. I didn't know how many years would pass or how many mistakes I would make. I only knew one thing. I no longer wanted to simply save myself. I wanted to change. And this realization became a new starting point. The beginning of a journey that would take me far beyond that girl from the house by the river. College became a different kind of challenge for me. Here, I didn't have to survive in the literal sense, but I did have to learn to be around people without completely closing myself off. This proved unexpectedly difficult. I was used to relying only on myself, not asking for help or showing weakness. In the world of study and socializing, this strategy didn't work well. Here, trust was required, at least partial. I continued to live with Nora and Emmy, but the rhythm of our lives changed. I left early in the morning and returned late at night. Nora took on some of the household chores and did so without complaint, as if she understood that this was our shared contribution to the future. Emmy sometimes got angry, saying I had become a stranger, that I wasn't there like before. These words hurt, but I knew it was temporary. I promised myself that someday I would be able to give her more than just a constant presence. My studies fascinated me. I chose a major in pedagogy and social work, although at the time I didn't fully understand why. I simply felt that I wanted to be somewhere where I could protect, explain, and support. During lectures, I often caught myself listening not only to the content but also to the subtext. I saw students who, like me, tried to remain inconspicuous. I saw those who laughed too loudly, hiding their anxiety. I began to understand people more deeply than before. It was in college that I met James. He was a few years older than me, in a different department, and worked part-time in the library. We often crossed paths there, among the bookcases and long tables. He was calm, attentive, spoke softly, and always looked me in the eye without judgment. This immediately set him apart. Our conversations began with simple conversations about books and assignments. I kept my distance as I was accustomed to. He didn't rush things, didn't ask unnecessary questions. It felt unusual and safe. Gradually, I found myself looking forward to these meetings, curious about his opinions, his view of the world. When he once suggested we just go for a walk after class, I agreed, but I took Emmy with me. It was my unspoken test. If someone isn't ready to accept my entire reality, then they're not ready to be around me. James wasn't surprised. He spoke to Emmy with the same respect he had to me, listening to her stories, asking questions. I noticed how she first grew wary, then relaxed. This was important. The past, however, wouldn't let go. Any attempt at intimacy made me anxious. When James once took my hand, I flinched and pulled it away without even thinking. He apologized immediately, even though he'd done nothing wrong. This made me realize for the first time how deeply my old fears linger within me. For a long time, I hesitated to talk about my past. Not because I was ashamed, but because I feared the reaction. Too many times I'd been unheard, disbelieved, or turned away. But one evening, as we sat on a park bench, I felt like if I didn't tell him now, I never would. I didn't tell him everything, only as much as I could, about home, about fear, about having to grow up too soon. He listened silently. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, didn't try to console me with meaningless words. When I finished, he simply said he was sorry I had to go through this, and that he respected my strength. His words were simple, but there was no pity in them, only recognition. That was a turning point for me. At the same time, I became increasingly involved in practical work. As part of my studies, I completed an internship at a family support center. There, for the first time, I saw how many children lived in conditions very similar to those in which I grew up. The same downcast eyes, the same wariness, the same habit of silence. I saw this and felt something both strong and heavy welling up inside me. I started staying after work longer than expected. I helped with paperwork, talked to the children, and simply sat nearby if they weren't ready to talk. The director of the center once noticed this and said I had a rare quality, the ability to be there without demanding. Those words stuck with me for a long time. Meanwhile, Nora finished school and entered art school. It was her own decision, and I was proud of her. She became more confident and began smiling more often. Emmy entered adolescence, and with that came its own difficulties, outbursts of anger, questions about the past, about her parents, about why our family was like this and not like others. We talked a lot. Sometimes we cried. Sometimes we fought. But we talked, and that was the main difference from our childhood. One day, Emmy asked me point blank why I was so afraid to let her go alone. I was silent for a long time, then told the truth, not the whole truth, but enough. I told her the world could be a dangerous place, and that my sternness wasn't due to mistrust, but fear for her. She listened attentively, unexpectedly serious. Then she simply hugged me. That moment became further proof to me that we were on the right path. Over the years, the guilt I carried within me began to change. It didn't disappear, but it ceased to be destructive. I began to understand that responsibility for evil always lies with the perpetrator, not with those forced to survive. This understanding didn't come overnight. It was born slowly, through conversations, through work, through love. James and I took our time. Our relationship developed slowly on my terms. He accepted it without pressure. Sometimes I felt like for the first time in my life, I was learning to be with someone not out of necessity, but out of desire. It was both terrifying and beautiful. By the end of my studies, I knew exactly what I wanted. I wanted to create a place where children and teenagers could feel safe. Not just a temporary shelter, but a space where they would be heard, where they would be helped to understand what had happened to them, and where they would be given tools for the future. This idea was no longer abstract. It had become a plan. I didn't yet know how exactly I would implement it. I didn't know where I would get the money, support, or strength. But I knew why. And this why was stronger than any fear. The past was no longer my prison. It had become a foundation, heavy, uneven, but strong. And on this foundation, I was going to build something new. Something that would prove that even from the darkest history, light can emerge. There remained the final chapter of this journey. The one where everything I had been through would find meaning not only for me, but for others as well. Sometimes the most important decisions aren't made in the moment, but after a long journey, when a person no longer runs from the past but faces it head-on. For me, that moment was the year after graduating from college. I was working at a family support center, still living there with Nora and Emmy, building a relationship with James, and gradually realizing it was time to take the next step. Not for ambition or recognition, but for meaning. The idea of a space of my own for children and teenagers no longer gave me peace. I saw how many stories remain unsaid, how often help is limited to temporary measures, without addressing the root of the pain. I knew I needed a place where I could not only wait out danger, but also begin to recover. A place where fear wouldn't be the norm and silence a sign of loneliness. I started small, with conversations, with questions, with researching laws, opportunities, and support programs. I wrote letters, went to meetings, explained my idea over and over again. Sometimes I was rejected. Sometimes they smiled politely but skeptically. I didn't give up. In this, I was persistent, almost stubborn, a trait that had once helped me survive and now helped me build. James supported me unconditionally. He didn't try to lead, didn't make decisions for me. He was there, and that was enough. When I doubted, he reminded me how much I'd already accomplished. When I was tired, he took care of the little household chores, freeing up my time and energy. It was a quiet, reliable support I'd once never even dared to dream of. Nora also contributed. She offered to help with the decor, the design, the atmosphere. She wanted the place to feel different from an institution. She wanted it to be warm, bright, and vibrant. Her drawings became the first decorations on the walls. They were filled with hope, the very hope we'd once sought blindly. Emmy was wary of the idea at first. She was afraid I'd disappear back into work, that we'd become smaller as a family. We talked about this for a long time. I explained that I wasn't doing this in our stead, but because of us. That everything I was building grew out of our story. Over time, she accepted this. And then one day, she said she wanted to help, just be there for the younger children, play with them, show them that adults can be kind. At that moment, I realized the circle was truly closing. We rented our first space on the outskirts of town. A small house with a garden and an old veranda. It was far from ideal, but it had the most important thing, the opportunity to start. We called this place Quiet Dawn. Not because mornings are always easy, but because after the longest night, light comes quietly, almost imperceptibly, but inevitably. The first children arrived unexpectedly quickly. Some were recommended by social services, others by friends. The stories were different, but the pain was remarkably similar. I didn't try to be their savior. I was simply there. I listened. I explained. Sometimes I was silent along with them. I knew how important it was not to rush, not to pressure, not to demand a quick recovery. The work was hard. There were days when I returned home completely devastated. There were nights when I relived old dreams. But now I knew what it was all for. Every small step forward, every smile, every moment of trust was worth sleepless nights. Over time, people started talking about the center. At first quietly, then louder. Volunteers, specialists, people willing to help appeared. We expanded slowly, carefully, without losing the most important thing, the human connection. I've always said that rules are important, but safety doesn't start with locks. It starts with respect. James and I got married without a big ceremony, simply because we wanted to be a family, not just for show, but in essence. He became a part of our world so naturally, as if he'd always been there. We took our time with the children. The center was already full of voices and stories. But later, when we decided to take a girl into our care, the decision came calmly and confidently. I knew I could now give her what I'd once been deprived of. Years passed. Nora became a famous illustrator, working with children's books, often returning to the center, holding workshops. Emmy became an elementary school teacher. She said she wanted to be the first adult a child could trust. I looked at them and realized that we had truly broken the chain. Sometimes people asked me about the past, about how I started all this. I didn't tell everything, not because I was ashamed, but because some stories belong only to you. But I've always said the most important thing. Silence protects evil, and the truth, spoken in time, can save a life. Now, sitting on the veranda of my house in Savannah, I often think about that girl from the house by the river. The one who grew up too soon, endured too much, kept silent for too long. I'd like to hug her and tell her that she'll get through this, that her pain won't be the end of the story, that from it will grow a force capable of changing lives. I don't consider myself a hero. I'm simply a person who made a choice when there was almost no choice. The world hasn't become perfect. There's still much darkness in it. But I know that even one safe home, one heard voice, one saved child's fate is already a victory. If there's one thing life has taught me, it's that the past doesn't have to determine the future. We can bear our scars with dignity and turn them into signs of survival. And if my story helps someone find the courage to speak up, to leave, to defend, or to start over, then it was all worth it. My name is Martha Evelyn Rose, and this was my story, not about pain, but about what comes after, about the quiet dawn that eventually comes.